Welcome all to our conversation about the malaise of illness, featuring Brad Bolman, a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say that I'm the Dean of the Graham School here at the University of Chicago. And I will welcome you virtually to our gorgeous campus, which is as glowing today as it looks here, although cold as well. So we are very lucky to be looking at its glory from inside. We at the Graham School are very proud to be a founding member of this university. When William Rainey Harper and John D. Rockefeller were imagining how the university could have its impact in the world, and thinking about how they could, and I quote, revolutionize university study in this country, they decided to create the first extension in US higher education, which was an idea of extending the assets and educational approach of the university to learners who might want to participate in this intellectual community from any age or stage or place in life. And to this day, we remain trailblazers in lifelong learning. And we do that by really looking at the big ideas that challenge and change the world through programs and classes in the lifelong liberal arts and society. There are 4 programs in total: a Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the world, a basic program of liberal education for adults where you can go deep into the great books of the Western tradition, an open enrollment catalog where you can look deeply across all of the disciplines of our university, and that's where the class that Instructor Bolman will be in the winter. And then we have annual programs that allow you to better know Chicago and glimpse into the future of museum publishing. I will just say that this is the holiday season, and we're incredibly grateful to all of you who are part of our donor community, including our Graham Circle that makes all of our work at the Graham School possible. And we also want to make sure that you know about 2 holiday-related initiatives. First, our book drive that is in partnership with my very own library, that is making sure that we bring gently used books into classrooms across Chicago to expand literacy. And second, we will have an event, a holiday gathering on the 15th, that will also have the theme of broadening access, where we will talk with 3 instructors who have helped us to expand the learning group at Graham to make sure that we better reflect and engage with the full community of stakeholders. But why you are here today, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, is to hear from Brad Bolman, one of our upcoming instructors, and we are incredibly grateful to have him with us. Brad is a historian of science, medicine, and technology, focused on the history of capitalism and inquiries into non-human life. His first book project, The Dog Years, explores how the beagle became the de facto and de jure breed of experimental dog in disciplines as far afield as radiobiology, pharmacology, periodontology, inhalation toxology, and Alzheimer's research. And I'm just thinking about that cuteness of the beagle when I read about his work. His second project, the Decomposition book, explores the global history of mycological science, analyzing shifting experimental and field practices, as well as industrially sponsored research as scientists attempted to make sense of the strange universe of fungi. In 2021, he received a PhD from the Department of History of Science at Harvard University. He has 4 peer-reviewed journal articles and 2 book chapters published, and maybe more since this biography was written, and that are under review in a number of popular publications. And I want to start by laying the table, Brad, for why you decided to teach this course. I know your research sits at the intersection of science, environmental history, and the history of capitalism, and yet you're going to be, sharing a course on Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, a book written 100 years ago as a literature piece. Tell us about that background and how you came to this topic for your course.
Absolutely, and thank you, Seth, for that very wonderful introduction. Yeah, so I think that those looking at the bio or hearing it now might be surprised to have someone whose main focus is on modern experimental science teaching a book or teaching a class on one of the great novels of the 20th century. But As a historian of science and medicine, one of my longstanding interests has been in the role of literature as a historical source, particularly when novels and stories speak to prevailing scientific concerns or perhaps index transformations in scientific and medical knowledge, which is absolutely the case with The Magic Mountain, as we'll talk about a little bit more. But also to think about novels and literary writing as tools of inquiry and as ways of thinking about both the past and present. So my thinking about this course, which fits within the novel knowledge series, was to be a bit literal about that. So I think what we're going to be looking at here is knowledge of the novel and knowledge that exists inside of novels. And hopefully, by looking at Mann's novel, we'll gain some insights in a variety of directions. And I'll add also that in the early days of the pandemic in 2020, I spent quite a bit of time as a way to think about the present and to think about the confusion of our world by looking back to the 1918 flu pandemic and thinking about sort of an earlier time period and how individuals in the past thought about pandemic illness, how they related to disease, to quarantine, as a way to think about our present. And when the pandemic proceeded, like many of you, I also turned to literature as a way to think about our experience of disease and social turmoil. And one of the things that I noticed that I was a bit surprised about is that in the early years of the pandemic, as many of you all know, there were countless lists of books that would help us to understand the moment. And many pointed to Camus' The Plague or to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera. But I noticed that The Magic Mountain, which to me is a quintessential modern novel about disease, was absent from a lot of these lists, as if the book had very little to say to our present moment. And reading it during 2020, 21, and more recently, I felt quite the opposite, that if anything, this book, which is at this point almost a century old, has so much to say to our present, and at least in my perspective, has sort of regained a kind of scholarly and professional interest. So that was my interest in returning to this novel and reading it with students at the Graham School.
Wonderful. Well, just to set the table, I'm wondering if you can give, and I hate to say this as Graham School Dean, the Cliff Notes version of the book, just so we all have familiarity with the core plot line. And then we'll jump into some areas and even a passage from it that you've identified. But let's start with, give us the snapshot.
Absolutely. So The Magic Mountain, or Der Zauberberg in German, was written by Thomas Mann. It was begun right before World War I and was imagined as a follow-up to sort of one of his earlier works and imagined to be a sort of short novella. But the war years caused Mann to sort of fundamentally rethink the project, and it took him about 10 years to complete the text. And so in the simplest sense, The Magic Mountain tells the story of what the book describes repeatedly as a very ordinary young German man, Hans Castorp, as he goes to a Swiss sanatorium to visit his cousin, Joachim Siemsen, who is at the sanatorium recovering from a bout of tuberculosis. And Castorp intends to visit his cousin very briefly, staying for only 3 weeks. But, and I don't think I'm giving away anything about the book here, he ends up staying quite a bit longer, for more than 7 years. So the novel is really about Hans's experience at this sanatorium, and it's very much restricted to the space and the social world of the sanatorium. But as one of the great sort of intellectual novels of the 20th century, the book is about so much more than those places. It's very clear that Mann wanted the sanatorium to emerge as a kind of metaphor or allegory for European culture in this pre-war moment. The book is so it is about sort of Europe's disintegration, its rapid acceleration into warfare, but it's also a novel about a lot of the transformations of the time period, technological transformations, new ideas about time, the physical world, about biology. So in the one sense, it's a very simple novel about a visit and what some would think of as a quest or adventure, but it opens onto so many more questions, and that's what makes it such a rich text to read today.
And you made the argument, Brad, that this should have been on that list that help us understand COVID, like Camus and Love in the Time of Cholera. Let's extend that argument a little bit. Why, based on what you've just described, based on the reading, is it helpful in helping us understand the current moment? And what does it give you? I mean, as someone reading it during the pandemic, how did it help you to look at that moment differently than you might have without that book in your life?
Absolutely. And as I was mentioning, I think a lot of the novels that we were pointed to as ways in to think about the pandemic, to think about our experience, were novels about catastrophe and sort of catastrophic loss. So The Plague is very much a novel about the difficulty of dealing with mass death. And I think those concerns were very much at the top of everyone's mind early in the pandemic. The Magic Mountain is not about mass death or suffering, even if that's very much in the background of the book. I think instead it's a novel about social isolation, about community, about the experience of living with disease, about also the uncertainty of dealing with disease. One of the issues that comes up multiple times in the novel is that it's not entirely clear who actually has tuberculosis, whether they're really suffering from a disease, whether they're dealing with a more psychologically generated challenge. And I thought that some of these themes really speak to a lot of the issues that many of us are grappling with now, this sense of having been in quarantine or isolation for multiple years, having lost something of our lives during that process, this sense of a kind of cleavage in our existential perspective between what people talk of as the before times and the now times. And I thought that the book really allows you to, in a very rich and literary way, to think about that experience of time, because it's a very long novel. Hundreds of pages are dedicated to the span of about a year, and then hundreds of more pages are given to the span of 6 years. And Thomas Mann, in writing it, was very preoccupied with how we think about time, how we can narrate time. And so for me, when I think time has become such an essential part of thinking about the pandemic or the post-pandemic experience, Magic Mountain is a fantastic book in that sense. In another way, I thought the book was very helpful also in thinking about the role of nostalgia in our present perspective, talking with both younger friends and older ones, family members. I think there's a pervasive sense that we've maybe lost something that we once had, that the sort of crisis of the last few years has fundamentally transformed our lives or sort of ruined something that we once had. And so in one sense, returning to this book from the 1920s is a very nostalgic movement. It's a return to a past time. Many see the novel as kind of fundamentally a historical novel about a very particular moment in time. But I think the novel also interrogates nostalgia and the sense of trying to recover something that's lost, of lost friends, lost family members. So I think it offers a way also for us to think about what nostalgia is doing for us now, what nostalgia means for how we think about sort of our present life, but also our future. So I think that's something valuable. That's something I hope we can talk about in the course as well. And the last thing that's very interesting to me, of course, is the question of the history of medicine and biology. And as a book that's very much about disease, but also about the whole sort of intellectual universe of science and medicine in the 1920s, I think it offers this wonderful opportunity to look at ideas that existed then, to read them against sort of what we know now, to see these tensions, but also these continuities between historical ideas about life, about biology, about disease, about health, psychology. There's so much that's in the book, and I thought it would be a really sort of interesting opportunity as well. Whether we live in a post-truth moment or not anymore, it's not entirely clear to me, but I think these questions about truth, about what's real, what do we experience, so much of this is still so relevant to us. And I thought that taking a historical perspective on this novel might be very productive.
Well, so this is a great text to read as well, just because the passages are so powerful. And so one thing that we talked about in advance, Brad, was you might be open to reading a passage that you thought particularly symbolized the, kind of ideas that you just shared, and that kind of brought out, how you could see, these conversations about nostalgia and beyond. And so can we ask you to read that passage? And then I just have one more question for those in the audience, and we're coming to your question. So yeah, Brad, let me turn it over to you to dazzle us with the words of this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think two of the most spectacular passages of the book are dream sequences, and I didn't want to do either of those here, so you'll have to take the class if you want access to those wonderful passages. But one of the moments in the text that really stuck with me is a moment kind of midway through the experience when Hans Castorp, our protagonist, begins to settle into the sanatorium, and he becomes a little bit obsessed with reading about biology. And he buys all these biological textbooks, and he kind of has this rhapsodic encounter with the world of biology and engaging with this question of what is life and what is death. So I thought I'd read that, not only because it's so rich and wonderful, but because it's also about falling in love with a book that you've purchased, which I think is very fitting for this course as well. So his cousin asks him why he doesn't just rent or borrow some of these books from the sanatorium, and Mann writes here, but Hans Castorp replied that he wanted to own the books himself. It was different reading a book that you owned. And besides, he loved to take his pencil and underline at will. Joachim listened for hours to the sound coming from his cousin's balcony, a paper knife slipping through uncut pages. The volumes were heavy, cumbersome. When reclining, Hans Castorp propped the lower edge on his chest or stomach, which hurt a little, but was simply part of the bargain. His mouth hanging half open, he would let his eyes glide down each learned page, illuminated by the reddish light from his shaded lamp, though if it had to come to that, he could just as easily have read by the bright moonlight. His head would lower until his chin lay on his chest, and he would hold that pose a while, lost in thought, perhaps, or musing in a doze, half asleep, before lifting his head for the next page. While the moon followed its prescribed path across the high mountain valley, glistening like a crystal below, he would read, pursue his study of organized matter, of the characteristics of protoplasm, that self-sustaining, delicate substance that hovers intriguingly between synthesis and dissolution, and whose basic forms have remained the same as when it first assumed rudimentary shape. He read with burning interest about life and its sacred yet impure mystery. What was life? No one knew. It was aware of itself the moment it became life, that much was certain, and yet did not know what it was. Consciousness, as sensitivity to stimuli, was undoubtedly aroused to some extent at even the lowest, most undeveloped stages of its occurrence. It was impossible to tie the emergence of consciousness to any particular point in life's general or individual history, to link it, for instance, to the presence of a nervous system. The lowest animals had no nervous systems, let alone a cerebral cortex, cortex, and yet no one dared deny that they were capable of responding to stimuli. And you could anesthetize life, life itself, not just the special organs capable of the response that informs life, not just the nerves. You could temporarily suspend the responses of every speck of living matter in both the plant and animal kingdoms, narcotize eggs and sperm with chloroform, chloral hydrate, or morphine. Consciousness of self was an inherent function of matter once it was organized as life. And if that function was enhanced, it turned against the organism that bore it, strove to fathom and explain the very phenomenon that produced it, a hope-filled and hopeless striving of life to comprehend itself, as if nature were rummaging to find itself in itself, ultimately to no avail, since nature could not be reduced to comprehension, nor, in the end, can life listen to itself. What was life? No one knew. No one could pinpoint when it had emerged from nature and struck fire. Nothing in the realm of life was self-actuated or even poorly actuated from that point on. And yet life seemed to have actuated itself. If anything could be said about it then, it was this: life structure had to be so highly developed that nothing like it could occur in the inanimate world. And I'll just stop there instead of continuing on, but hopefully that gave everyone a sense of the book.
Well, it certainly did, and I think it only added to our excitement to read the rest. We did get a question. Well, we're going to come to questions in a moment. This one feels very timely. Which translation, Brad, are you reading from?
Yes, so this translation is the more recent one by John Woods, which was done in the 90s, I believe. The older translation is also quite wonderful, and it preserves one of Mann's intentions, which is that at various points in the book, the language shifts from German to French. The Woods translation actually renders much of this French in English. So for that reason, I chose it. I think it makes the book most approachable to modern readers who may not be entirely fluent in French. But there's something to be said also for the experience of reading the older translation.
Well, so I have one more question, then we're going to turn to your questions. So please start chatting them in. And my question is actually about the approachability of your upcoming course. The book is 700 or so pages. You just read, it is beautiful, but it is, intense. It's dealing with illness and death and, these big, heady concepts. Talk to us about how you're going to approach teaching this over 10 weeks, essentially what's on your syllabus and how do you format your approach to teaching the course?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's a big book. It's a delight to read. The literary critic Susan Sontag talked about reading the entire book in about 2 days when she was in high school. So it's certainly one that you can get lost in and really breeze right through. But I thought that part of also my interest in teaching this course was to also recapture something of that quarantine experience of the slowness of time, of really taking our time and sort of going through this book at a leisurely pace to really focus on the language, on some of the ideas. So we're going to read the book as slowly as the time of this course allows. Which is perhaps still faster than one might ideally do, but I think we'll certainly give everyone enough time to work through the text. Now, I am, of course, not, as we established early on, a literary critic. So my approach here is not so much to unearth, maybe the secrets of the text or to engage in a sort of fundamental critical reading of the book, but to really use this opportunity for all of us to read together. And that means, I think, that one can come to this course having never read Thomas Mann before. One could come to this course knowing very little about German life or about the history of tuberculosis. I think none of those things are a prerequisite, because what I really want us to do is to sort of collectively read this text and think about how it speaks to our present, and also perhaps how it doesn't maybe speak to our present, what might change. That said, we will be reading a few sort of connected essays, both some items from the history of medicine, about the history of the sanatorium, about the history of tuberculosis, a little bit about German science in the early 20th century. But I mean these things really to be supplements and to kind of enrich the experience of reading the novel. And my focus at a fundamental level is really to focus on the text itself and to let the text to kind of guide us, and to perhaps in the meantime build something of a community among all of us who will be reading the book very separately in our individual homes, but also collectively, I think, together in this course online. So it's both a very solitary, but hopefully both a very communal experience. That's my hope.
Well, so we have our first question here from Richard Fisher, who acknowledges your lovely and cogent presentation, which I echo. He wants to know whether you're going to make connections or references to shorter Mann work, such as Novella Tristan or The Desperate Shenanigans of Detlef Spinell, or to later parts of Buddenbrooks and the Aesthetics of Sickness, Decadence, and Death. Sickness is part of family history, its structure and decline. So yeah, I'm curious, this is not just a one-off from Mann. There are a number of ways in which Mann is engaging these values as an author, and just curious kind of how that might come into the class or not.
Absolutely. So sickness is and perhaps disease are essential themes throughout much of Mann's work, and it speaks to a longer German tradition that Mann was very much inheriting, that connected sickness with a certain sense of heightened conscience, or sort of artistic and intellectual capacity. That it was really the sick man who had unique insight and kind of unique ability to produce the great works. I wanted very much for this course to stand on its own and not to necessarily ask too much of its students. So I won't be assigning any of the other Mann texts. But that said, I think there's a lot to be said for thinking about how illness appears in this text, how it relates to some of the earlier works of Mann, because it's absolutely a longstanding theme throughout a lot of his texts. We'll be reading one or two critical essays which do a bit of this work, connecting some of the themes of sickness in Magic Mountain to some of the earlier Mann texts. So there will be opportunities to talk about that, but I'll just say that at the forefront, it's not sort of my central concern, because I didn't want this class to become inaccessible to those who have not had the time to read all of Magic Mountain, let alone Buddenbrooks, which is a huge text, let alone all of Mann's other novels. So I'm trying to make this an experience that many can take, but I think it would be heightened for those who have the opportunity to read some of Mann's other texts, either beforehand or after.
Well, Brad, you mentioned not being a literary critic. You are a historian, and this next part is going to potentially build on that. Ira Pilchin asks, would you say that tuberculosis was a more disruptive force in American history than we generally think about? There are a couple other questions here, but I'll start with that one.
Yes, it's a good question. I think it's difficult in some ways for in this contemporary moment for us to recognize just how disruptive and damaging tuberculosis was in the 20th century. For quite a long time, and also before then, tuberculosis was very much associated with death, because it was this sort of pervasive factor in European life, but also in American life. It was for many years the largest cause of death in the United States. So it was this absolutely horrific and really socially transformative experience. One of the paradoxes of both the Magic Mountain and also the sanatoria more generally is that it's probably one of the worst ways that one could respond to tuberculosis, by taking all of the people who have it and putting them together in a kind of isolated circumstance. On the one hand, it does, to some extent protect those who are outside the sanatorium from disease, but it also produces all kinds of conditions for the magnification of illness and for further kinds of disease spread. So the sanatorium was a very particular kind of response to the problem. it really did restructure many aspects of American life and also life elsewhere. And that's part of why I wanted to assign some of the texts that we're going to read about the history of TB, because I think that although today, of course, we know that drug-resistant forms of tuberculosis are once again emerging as a genuine social threat, I think a lot of this earlier history has kind of fallen from our view, and there's value in recapturing some of that and thinking about it once again. I think the second part of this question was about parallels between One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I'll say that I think there perhaps are parallels to be made there, but certainly a different set of parallels than I was originally thinking about. But this is perhaps something we can talk about more over the course of our quarter.
Well, another parallel here is from Greg Gosick, who mentions that Mann himself stated he had first intended The Magic Mountain as a short comedic sequel to Death in Venice. Are there explicit connections between those works and what led Mann to take the major departure from his earlier plan?
Absolutely, yeah. So Greg is very much right to point out that as I noted earlier, the Magic Mountain was meant to be this short kind of follow-up novella. I think there were two things that both inspired Mann and changed the ultimate result of the text. On the one hand, The Magic Mountain was inspired very much by the experience of his wife, who had gone to a Swiss sanatorium to treat what was understood to be a case of tuberculosis that she was facing. Just like Hans Castorp, the protagonist of this novel, Mann went to visit his wife, intending to stay for a very short time. So The Magic Mountain is in this way a somewhat autobiographical text, and I think it's undeniable that Mann identifies slightly with Hans Castorp. And in that way, I think that the book was meant to be something of a criticism of medical thinking. Mann's wife, Katja, was ultimately probably not sick with tuberculosis, but within the structure of the sanatorium, there was a kind of incentive or momentum to diagnose. So a sense that people might not recognize that they are sick or might have a sickness that can't be fully diagnosed. This is something that appears throughout The Magic Mountain, that Hans Castorp probably doesn't have tuberculosis, but he kind of wants to believe that he does, and he continues to be diagnosed with it. And no one can really leave the sanatorium very easily because there's always a further justification to stay forever. So in one sense, the book starts out as kind of a critique of medical thinking, of diagnostic technique. But I think that Mann's experience, both of World War I, which is this shattering moment in early 20th century European history, but also perhaps to a lesser extent with the great 1918 flu pandemic, is to transform some of those concerns and to sort of reimagine how they might relate to this fundamentally transformed European context. So the book does not end, I don't think, as a sort of critique of the doctor. It's a much more ambiguous, I think, investigation into the causes of illness, the relationship between psychological illness and what we would maybe think of as more physiological or biological illness. It's about the challenge of grappling with disease. And it's also about disease as a metaphor and allegory for these other broader kind of civilizational or social concerns. So starting out from this much shorter novella standpoint, I think it opens up into a much more complex and intricate examination of a whole host of intersecting themes. So, and it is funny. I mean, I think found the book quite a bit funnier than some earlier critics found it to be. I'll just add that in 1985, the late Harold Bloom had said that this book is kind of unrecognizable to the present reader, that a reader in 1985 really doesn't have much sense of this novel. But I don't know. I felt that in my reading and in this contemporary moment, it really did speak to the present, and I found it funny and tragic at sort of at the same time. So what we're left with is not a short novella, but this very large, complex novel that's about dreams and time and everything else. So that will be hopefully that responds to the question perhaps a bit more than it needed to.
Beautifully, and that really gave us a good sense of how they relate and then why he decided to go deeper. I want to kind of take a step back. This is part of our Novel Knowledge series, which we have the joy of partnering with the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge, where you're a fellow. The goal of this series is to really bring unconventional and new knowledge to learners. And the way we get there is through multidisciplinary thinking, by bringing these different strands of thoughts into new formulations to help us understand the world in new ways. And on that note, I'm curious to talk a little bit about how this intersection between the humanities and humanistic inquiry and the sciences, how that can help us to lead to new thinking. We kind of talked about how we can, have science influencing our understanding of the text. But you're a historian of science. I'm curious if we can go the other way. If you were to take this book into scientists, to doctors, how do you think these texts can help us to actually think about wellness and science differently, if that's a fair question?
Well, it's a great question and a very large question. So I think that it's quite clear to me, and from a reading of the history of medicine, the history of science, that despite perhaps a tendency in the modern period to think about literature and science or literature and medicine as existing on separate sides of a spectrum of knowledge, of course, these two things have been so interrelated for such a long time that many of the great doctors and scientists of the 20th century were motivated by novels and books that encouraged them to think about the world differently, whether those were books like Aerosmith, which was for a long time this kind of text for training doctors, or whether even farther afield books, science fiction texts, which have inspired geologists and astrobiologists to think about their work very differently. I think it's important for us to really understand that there's a two-way street between the kind of hard work of collecting facts and making diagnoses and the more speculative and literary work of trying to analyze our world and think about how we experience that world, what it's like to be human, what it's like to be alive. And so this book is just unquestionably trying to do that kind of thing. It's not, of course, a scientific investigation, but it is, I think, very much about, or at least speaks to, some of these concerns that feel so present to me. The sense of, if I go to teach a class that's in person with 20 students, what level of protection do I need to have? What is the risk that we encounter when we're in a space when we as individuals may have some kind of scientific sensibility that we've developed by reading articles or books about, but in some fundamental way, a lot of these things are a bit unknowable to the individual. There's kind of a gap between the scientific medical knowledge and how we might existentially or experientially go about our lives. And I think that's one of the themes that's so present in this text. Is Hans Castorp really sick? Does he become sick from his experience with other people? But also, what are the different paths to cure? That on the one hand, there are certain characters in the book who seem to be cured or potentially receive treatment that's very conventionally medical, surgical, and even psychoanalytic. But I think there's also a suggestion in the book that part of the cure to living, part of what makes life worth living is risk, is the joy of falling in love, the experience of kind of being out in nature and having these adventures. to me, those kinds of concerns and considerations are just undeniably important for doctors who are thinking about how to treat patients today, and to scientists who are trying to think about, the world that we now inhabit. And I thought that one of the parallels that seems to exist in the book, and that I would love to talk with students about, is the sense of the kind of unknowability of tuberculosis in the present, and what I think some of us are dealing with now with this question of long COVID. Is there a condition that is produced by having had this illness that transforms our lives, that makes us less energetic, less, whatever the symptoms might be? Are these things attributable to some kind of illness that we can't quite identify, can't quite fully name, that we don't understand? Or are some of these issues the results of years of being alone, of not being able to spend time with our loved ones, of losing track of some of the goals that we had for the last few years? This interplay between the social and the biological conditions of illness, I think it's just a fundamental question that scientists and individuals today have to really grapple with. And so that's one of the things to me that's so important about this book, and important about literature more broadly, is that it can ask some of those questions without prescribing an answer, but give us room to reflect on those concerns.
Well, Brad, we are almost out of time, but we have a few questions remaining. So we're going to make these power round, and we'll see if you're even familiar with some of the references here, because I realize film critic is not in your background set. But is there a parallel with key aspects of the movie The Mortal Storm, starring Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan, who has a systemic illness? Do you know that film by chance?
Well, I will both answer quickly and as a good teacher, admit areas where I don't know. So I'll have to say that I don't know The Mortal Storm, but I promise to watch it before we start the course, and I will have a better answer then.
And this person, Margaret Collins, just finished the Irish author Colm Tobin's The Magician, which it sounds like is a fictionalized biography of Mann and his family, which sounds quite interesting. Any comments on that? That is a really fascinating, that this author has commanded that kind of attention to have a fictional narrative written about him.
Well, again, I will answer quickly that I also have not yet had a chance to read this. All of his works are fantastic, and so I would recommend it even without reading. I think that Mann presents a really intriguing figure, I think, in the present moment. This really, great and profound novelist who wrote so many of these sort of classic, real book stopper types of novels, but in some ways I think has been superseded by some of the other writers of the 20th century. It is not so prominent maybe in the public consciousness. So I think it's interesting for us to also return to Mann and what this novel might say about him. It is certainly a quasi autobiographical novel, but it's not, I think, as directly autobiographical as Buddenbrook's, for instance. I don't know. I'll leave it there. But he's a fascinating figure, and the essay that we'll read from Sontag actually includes her visit, a kind of pilgrimage to meet Mann after her reading of The Magic Mountain for the first time, which is at one and the same time a kind of fantastic experience and a slight disappointment, because meeting your literary idol cannot but fail to live up to the expectations. So we'll have an opportunity to talk more then.
Well, this has been a spectacular conversation. I know that I am excited even more about your class when I already came into this conversation with great enthusiasm. And I'll just share that I think one of the things that is happening even in this conversation is going to play out in the class, which I know we talked about in advance. We have a learning community that has extraordinary life experience. And I think, young scholar coming in with this unique way of looking at this text incredible people of all ages and stages able to look at it with you. I just think what's going to happen in your classroom is going to be spectacular. And I look forward to hearing about those conversations that play out in the weeks ahead in the winter. Thank you all for joining us. We are incredibly grateful to have you here. And Brad, thank you for teaching at our university as well as at the Graham School. We're very grateful for the partnership with IFK and the opportunity to bring new knowledge to our community. I hope everyone has a happy rest of your day. And for those who we don't see beforehand, happy holidays.
Thanks very much, everyone.